Before I really begin this talk in earnest, a bit more about the author of our reading earlier. Ursula K. Le Guin is a beloved name among writers and fans of what is sometimes called speculative fiction. She was also the child of Alfred and Theodora Kroeber. Alfred was a UC Berkeley cultural anthropologist. Theodora was an author who wrote the seminal book, Is She Between Two Worlds?, a biography of the last Californian Yahi Native American with whom her husband worked. As I mentioned earlier, the reading was from the very beginning of Le Guin's book, Always Coming Home. I've taken her title for our time today because of how central the notion of home is to my ministry, to my thinking, to my heart, and heck, I've just returned from 18 years away from the Bay Area. So this morning, I want to say a couple of things. I want to introduce myself to you. When this congregation looked for a minister, they were looking for a contract minister, which means the search committee interviews other fine candidates, in this case myself, and makes a recommendation to the Board of Trustees, and if the Board of Trustees feels it's a good recommendation, they agree and the minister is hired. And that's what happened this time. But that leaves the congregation a little bit out of it. If this was going to be a permanent assignment, the search committee would do its work, find a candidate, and then bring that candidate out for 9 or 10 days straight. The person would preach twice, and after the second sermon, they would go off and hide, and the congregation would vote. You have been denied that opportunity. I have been denied the opportunity to get to know all of you before I said yes. But your search committee was full of trustworthy folk. And I've been doing this a while. If the people who knew me that I provided as references didn't scare the search committee away, nothing would. And I'm looking down at the note. At 5 o'clock this morning, I had 2,500 words written, but I started writing this sermon months ago when I would start driving to work and I would think of my last sermon, what I would say to say goodbye to the folks I was serving up in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I did that one week. And then the next week I started thinking about what I'd say goodbye, and within a minute of the half-hour drive, I was thinking about how I wanted to introduce myself to all of you. So, you can want to sound wise and say that every moment in our lives brings us to where we are now. But in some ways, that's actually is true. So I want to introduce myself to all of you who didn't get a say in whether I was before you or not. And this is going to be brief. I want to respect everyone's time, but it's still going to go on a little bit. I was born into a second-generation Unitarian Universalist families. My parents met at the Channing Murray Unitarian Campus Ministry at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. According to family lore, the first thing my mother said to my father as a group she was with was tidying up, or somewhat tidying up, and the group my father was with was just settling in. My mother said to my father, "You'll want to soak that pot." The rest, as they say, it was history. My family was part of the secular humanist strain of our tradition. Before she died in December of 2009, it seemed that every time my mother and I spoke on the phone, she would ask me why her new minister felt the need to talk so much about Jesus Christ. Doing so felt like a step backward to her. To her and that minister's credit, They talked about this. They sat down at least twice. Though try as they might, they never found common ground for understanding. So it goes. We do our best. We do our best! And there are two little snippets from my early life as a Unitarian Universalist. First, when I was 7 or so, and this gets to the joys and possibilities of living in religious community. My family's lay-led Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in New Jersey held an international foods event after church one day. What I remember was there on a table was a glass bowl full of M&Ms. Seeing my eyes widen at this sight, taking them all in, the person behind the table said, "You can have as many as you want, but you have to use these," and proceeded to hand a pair of chopsticks. I had never seen chopsticks before. That day, I gained a life lesson in the power of incentive. The second little story comes from when I was 12 or so. By that time, the family had moved from the East Coast to the Chicago suburbs. My parents were active lay members, so after church, my brother and I would inevitably pull on their shirt sleeves so we can go home for lunch while they talked about boring things to other grown-ups during coffee hour. One day, they were talking with my Sunday school teacher, Shirley McDonald, I remember her name being, out on the way to the car. And because Mrs. McDonald might be telling them what a pain I was, I kept within earshot. Only they weren't talking about me. What I remember Ms. McDonald saying, she was telling my folks about marching in Selma with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I knew enough about MLK to be impressed. My teacher was part of making history? As you might imagine, I listened to her much more closely from then on. Reflecting back on that day years later, I realized that moment taught me another life lesson. We make history, all of us, every day. In what we do and what we say, in what and how we buy, we give shape to the wider world. Now, I'll spare you the minor saga, for now at least, of my sense of calling to ministry with one little telling facet. Every night at the dinner table during my late high school and early college years, there was some version of the following conversation between my parents. "Mom, Don, the minister has got to go." "Dad, now Emily, let's be reasonable about this." This extended cautionary tale taught me that what ministers do matters, and that it might be able to be done better than what I was experiencing. So in the summer of 1992, some months after my father died of pancreatic cancer, I put all my things in a U-Haul van, and one of my best friends, Todd, who I'm sure I'll talk about at some point, has a medical condition he can't drive. We drove out. He kept me awake by reading Edward Albee's The Monkey Wrench Gang to me. And while Todd had never been more than 100 miles west of the Mississippi River in his life, he swore that we would see 3 red VW microbuses before we got to my flat in Berkeley. And damn it, he was right. I had been living in the Midwest with my family since the age of 9, and I chose Berkeley because I wanted to see what life without winter would be. And there was a little more to it. I wanted to learn more about my namesake and be closer to where he had lived. Godfrey Eric Hildebrand, lordly, crazy name, was born to a ranching family in Lake County, California, roughly 100 miles north of San Francisco, just by Clear Lake. Before I came to the Bay Area for seminary, I had visited relatives in Lake County, but I hadn't walked on the land that the family used to ranch. My sense of the place was almost exclusively romantic. How the family ranched cattle and grew apricots and olives, and how, at the urging of aunts back in England, Eric rode his horse up to Vancouver and enlisted in the Canadian forces to take part in World War I, almost a year before the U.S. formally entered the war. He returned to California, finishing his service after 6 months' convalescence in England, a shadow of the man he had once been. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder now. We called it, as far as I know, soldier's heart then, much more poetic. Even so, the Great War didn't kill Eric. A hunting accident did. Afterward, the ranch was managed by a very different side of the family who did not value their role as trustees of the land. By the 70s, the last of the ranch was sold. And the last time I saw my mother's cousin Bob, he was explaining how proud he was that his daughter had been the last chief of staff to former President Ronald Reagan. A claim that seems dubious to me, did then, does now, but one that brought him great pride. I have family all over the Western Seaboard, not all of whom I'm in touch with. But that is a digression. Home. From the simple but resonant story Tanya shared with us earlier to our title today, home is a word with great meaning for me, one that echoes. As I see it, we are called to create a home for ourselves and others worthy of our promise and the beauty of the world. That's it, short and simple. If that's a mission statement for my ministry, that's it. For years, I would close each worship service I led with these words. May we also remember that we are people of love, providing a place in this world for our spirit, a place called home. And then I would say, let us now return to the challenge and joy of helping the world come alive in love. That's what my time in seminary helped me clarify. So seminary in Berkeley, and then to my first 10-year ministerial settlement just down 580 from here in Livermore, California. I need to confess this. I had my eyes on another congregation, but my first wife, Jennifer, wanted to be close to Berkeley while she finished her doctorate in musicology there. So, Livermore. As some things are, that marriage was short-lived. 3 years in, Jennifer realized she was lesbian. And while the end of the marriage rocked me, it also gave me time and space to discover who I was and how I wanted to live out the next years available to me. I knew that I was going to have a hard time at the end of the marriage, and I told myself that I would go down and be in the muck for a year, and then I would bounce back, and God laughed. That 1 year, I needed 10 years, but I came back. During the time I served our sibling congregation down the road, you and they hosted the then Pacific Central District's annual meeting twice, and that's how I got to know you early on. Other highlights of that tenure in ministry for me, at least, include a youth justice trip to New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, and the 2 weeks we opened our newly renovated worship space to a homeless family shelter while their own building was being renovated. So we had just gone through renovation. We knew about disruption. And while the families we hosted those 2 weeks may not have known it, they christened our new space with their presence. But after 10 years, it was time for a new challenge, and my mother's cancer had returned, so it was time for me to be closer to her, closer to the family home. After a year-long interim ministry in Rochester, New York, it was on to Columbus, Ohio, where your former minister, the Reverend Marco Bellatini, served as senior minister. I was fortunate to work with Mark for 7 of my 12 years in Columbus. During the second year there, close to the end of it, in March of 2010, I met the woman who would become my second wife, Anne de Leon. After our first meeting in a Columbus cafe, she insists we sat outside. I remember distinctly that we sat indoors. I walked back to my car, and all I could think of was, wow, wow, wow. We didn't rush anything, but it was clear we wanted to be together. I knew I wanted her with me, and I think she felt the same. Anyhow, Anne is finishing up her work in Boston this next week, and we'll be here almost soon enough afterward. But back to my little tale. I'm jumping ahead again. At the time I was in the associate minister in Columbus, second chair pastor, as I would like to call the role, serve at the pleasure of the senior minister. Theirs is the primary ministerial relationship with the congregation. When Reverend Marco retired, I knew I might need to move on. That turned out to be the case. I left Columbus because the new senior minister, their first female senior minister, wasn't going to be able to really settle in with me there. So after another year-long internship, this time in southeast Wisconsin, Anne and I headed north to Ottawa, Canada. For years, both of us had been interested in living in Canada. My first memory, actually, is of the Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome in the U.S. Pavilion at the 67 Worlds Expo in Montreal. My first wife happened to be from Toronto, and one of the things I needed to admit, at least to myself during the divorce, was how much I was grieved by losing access to her family's rustic cottage on a beautiful little lake. And Anne had had 4 glorious years in Calgary when she was in her 20s, and has still had family in what is there called the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, which has the population of half the nation. It's huge and crazy. But we found once we got to Ottawa, and I will move this along, that Canadian employers prefer a Canadian work experience. I had a job set up to me, but Anne could not find suitable work. And what I mean when I say suitable is work that paid anything. And we were losing money, barely able to make our bills, and so Anne took a job a year ago in the spring in Boston, an easy hour's drive from Ottawa. The job was advertised as being a hybrid one. We imagined that we would be able to see one another fairly often, only that didn't turn out to be the case. And she found that she really didn't fit in as a New Englander. It wasn't her. These things we learned, of course, over the course of time. While I originally thought I'd be looking for a congregation out east to serve, I applied for a couple out here out west, and I apologize to any of you who don't think a minister should use this kind of language from the pulpit. I applied to a couple of West Coast churches for shits and giggles. Don't let anyone tell you that the deity doesn't have a sense of humor. And then communication began with one of those left coast congregations I sent my name to. The search team from this congregation, Bob, Keith, Diane, Zelma, and Grace wrote in the most personal and inviting manner I had ever experienced while looking for a new congregation to serve. I don't know if I should have or not. I certainly didn't have permission, but I forwarded their emails to Ann in Boston. Both of us kind of fell in love with the search committee right there. And that both of us did is huge, because Ann hasn't always liked the people I work for and with. There are a lot of Unitarians out there. So we're going to jump ahead now. I think I've said, and I think it was shared in some of my materials, that I came back to the States because I needed to be part of what needs to happen here. For the first day and a half after the election results were in last November, I was really relieved to be at a bit of a distance in Canada. And then I realized my family's here. My home is here. I need to get back. My wife is here. I need to get back. Several weeks ago now, when I flew out from Ottawa to join Ann here and looking for a place to live, the U.S. border agent at the airport asked me the nature of my trip. To look for a place to live, I said. I've got a new job out in California. And then she looked at me and said, "Why are you coming back now?" Now, that was a question I have to admit I wasn't prepared to answer to a U.S. government employee. It was early Saturday morning, and I hadn't had my second coffee yet. I think I mumbled something about my work in Ottawa wrapping up. What I know is that I hemmed and hawed sufficiently enough that so the agent took pity on me, saying, maybe she shouldn't have asked me the question, before she said very clearly, "Welcome back home." It is good to be back, and it is heartbreaking to be back now. As soon as I got to the gate and the flight, I realized that I wished I would have been able to sit down with that border agent and say, "What was behind that question? Let's talk about what's going on." But that wouldn't have been, and this is a word that's necessary, but it's really awful, that wouldn't have been appropriate. Many things seem like they were when I left 4 years ago. But of course, LA and DC weren't under the thumb of armed security agents. This government hadn't been one that practiced disappearing people. And now Chicago and San Francisco are threatened to be next on the list with security agents. But there will be time to parse all of that out in the weeks and months to come. In the midst of all the overwhelm surrounding, if not permeating us in this extended moment, what I hope we'll hold close and remember is why truth really matters, why justice matters, why joy matters, while the sounds of little babies matter, why our stories and experiences matter. I hope we'll be able to keep in mind why we struggle for what we do, what our values are as we sort out just how best to carry them forward. We. Now, I've gone on at some length in our time this morning telling you a bit about who I am. What I need, what I want to do now is to ask you who you are. Prior to her talk here last week, Mileva and I talked about what she would say and how it might set the stage for my being with you today and beyond. At one point, she thought she might pass out cards last week for anyone in the room or on Zoom to write down something they wanted me to know. In the end, she decided not to do that, and I agreed. I could ask you myself what you'd like to say to me after all. And so I am. Who are you? What brought you here? What keeps you here? What is your most trustworthy joy? What worries keep you up at night? What are you most proud of? What do you hope for and need from me and this community of faith? What do your love and just anger call you to do? I've been lucky enough to travel to visit our cousins in faith, the Unitarians in Hungarian-speaking Transylvania, 3 times now. And one thing I learned early on is that they have a practice that is onerous but beautiful, and that in many of the perhaps more rural Unitarian congregations, it's expected that the minister will visit each and every member's home between New Year's and Easter. I've never done that. You're welcome. Yet. Whether I call you or please reach out to me, I'd really like to sit down with everybody here and on Zoom. They're not back there. Because beginnings are crucial times. How can we figure out what we're going to do together if we haven't figured out who we are to one another first? I can't call up that U.S. border agent at the airport in Ottawa. In Canada, our people go there so that the U.S. airports aren't unduly burdened. Lovely 800-pound gorilla, our nation. I can't call up that agent and say, let's talk about this. But I can talk to you. We can work this out. We can talk together. And from what we learn from one another, will help define and clarify and ground the work that we do together. I can't do it alone. I can't do it alone. This is what we do together, the work of this church, the work of this congregation. Beginnings are crucial times. Let's seize the opportunity. I can't wait to get this adventure side by side with you started. Welcome.